Good morning and welcome back, everybody who survived last night and is able to join us again this morning. I have the pleasure of being able to introduce Sergio Lopez Pinheiro in a moment, who is, as much as anyone else, responsible for the organization of yesterday and today. I want to begin having made some broader acknowledgments to everyone from Matt in the booth through Chantel to Helen Kongsgaard and the office team yesterday to focus just a little bit more this morning on the context of the office within the school. So in launching the Office for Urbanization, our mandate is to pursue applied design research projects with respect to questions of contemporary urbanization. And in so doing, it strikes us that there are really two primary questions. The first of those is the status of design research in the context of a research university. What is the modality of design work that we do? How can that constitute research as such? The second question for us really has more to do with the status of the urban question. What's the status of the project of the city today? And our working hypothesis for now is that most often in conversations of the city today, we see two very, very discrete discourses. On the one hand, there's a conversation about policy, regulatory environments, elected governance, decision-making, data, a whole range of other things which are vitally important. But that seems quite distinct and often quite separate from another discourse that's evident coming out of design culture, in which almost every urban project is a singularity. It's a particular site, it's a particular program, there is one developer, there is an architect attached, and everything distills down to an immediate question. Are you for the Olympics or against it? Are you for the football stadium? Or what about the rail yards? What about this particular driver? And of course, the media is deployed in both of those discourses in a variety of ways, not to mention our own scholarly and professional journals and the like. And so in that space, one mandate for the office that we've taken up is to provide a venue for a conversation or set of conversations about the city as a collective act, the shape of the city as collective form, and in that regard, looking also to always reconnect questions of policy and governance on the one hand to questions of form making and design culture on the other. It's that thinking that led us to this topic of heliomorphism. It's my general modus operandi, if you know me and my work in research, is to find a topic that I think might be productive for the next couple of years that I don't know a lot about, and then find the smartest people that know more about it than I do and invite them to a party and say, okay, tell me about this thing. And so by the end of these 2 days, I hope to know enough about this to be able to say something intelligent about it. In this regard, the other point to make came up briefly last night that I want to underscore is that the office, if it's going to be successful, will need to build a culture in which it's available as a platform. It's meant to be not just about me and my colleagues. It's meant to be an infrastructure that can enable and support a range of different activities. While we're not typically going to be convening conferences, it's not really what we're set up to do. In launching the office last night, it felt right to us to frame this event not around invited guests, not bringing people to the GSD, which we do quite a lot of, as you know, in our events program, but rather to turn that model around and say, we believe in the office that there are faculty and researchers and students already engaged in this topic, but we may not have had the institutional framework in which to understand that. And so my goal for the next several hours is to understand from our faculty and from their graduate students and from their research colleagues what are the questions that they're working on vis-a-vis solar performance and urban form, and how might the office be an infrastructure or a space for convening that kind of a conversation? Of course, the immediate downside, while the upside is clear, there's very little travel cost, apart from our two distinguished alums last night, hardly even any catering budget. I think we're doing this whole thing for $5,000. In that context, of course, among the various downsides to that format is that GSD faculty, they're all teaching. And so you'll see them come in, they'll do their turn at the microphone, and then they will return to their other duties. Along the way, they will go to 414, my office on the 4th floor, where they will meet Ricardo De Vesa, who's here from Urban Next, who's doing interviews with all of our talking head talent. But having said that, I am hopeful that between now and Iñaki Abalos's closing keynote this afternoon, we might be able to get some sense of an overview of this topic and its potential. What you're seeing up here is just a scroll through an animation of some work that we've been doing doing in the last few weeks in the Office for Urbanization, looking at questions of urban form, looking at the New York Zoning Code 1916 in response to questions of access to light and air, and that long-standing tension between the accumulation and reproduction of capital through urbanization on the one hand, and its regulation socially, environmentally, politically, through a whole series of other mechanisms, including the mechanisms of planning and zoning. What we've been doing in the office is doing some updates, some optimizations of those, some studies to understand if the same volume, if the same height restrictions, the same performance requirements around avenue and street were optimized for a reduction of shadow, so less shadow impact. And so that's the kind of design study that, while it's not a proposal for the future of Manhattan, might be indicative of the kind of work that we can get into. Without any further ado, I want to introduce to you Sergio Lopez Pinheiro, a former Kiley Fellow and lecturer in landscape architecture, who we're very pleased to have here, and who has been really a co-conspirator along with myself and Mariana Ibañez. Sergio.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to everybody for being here today, and special thanks to the speakers and hosts that so kindly are supporting this event with their time and the work. I also want to thank Charles for this opportunity. I'm delighted to support this new research and enterprise of the school, the Office for Urbanization. Let me see how this works. Okay, so heliomorphism is a perpetually important topic in the design of the built environment. The relationship between solar exposure and built form has consequences on multiple scales. It works and it is taken into account for the design of a single room within an apartment building, but it also has consequences in the whole planning of whole cities. On the top, you see Hilbersheimer's studies in 1944. In the bottom, there is a very nice drawing of Matus, Design for Northern Climates, where he compares the grids of the Jeffersonian grid, Spanish grid, particularly exemplified by the Plan-Cerdà in Barcelona, and then the Hamilton grid, which is the town where Matus was working in next to Lake Ontario, and he looks at the solar exposure and how actually just the orientation of the grid of the city makes a huge impact in the livability of the public space of the city. And so heliomorphism has this ability to connect all these multiscalar issues within the city within just one single topic. So the question is, why is it important to talk about heliomorphism now, today, as opposed to 10 years ago or 10 years from now? What is it relevant about the topic at this current moment in time? And is there something else that can be said that has not yet been said? In order to look at this, we've planned 3 panels or sets of conversations around 3 topics. And I would like to briefly present them to you now. The first one is plugins. And as it says in the program, I'm going to be reading this, Ralph Knowles' concept of the solar envelope proposed a design tool that anticipates contemporary interests in parametricism and relational modeling. The envelope offered a projective form through which urban morphology was indexed to solar performance. The technological developments of the last decade have enabled an unanticipated degree of precision and feedback, potentially infusing new possibilities into an idea that has half-century of history. Plugins revisits these changes, conceptual and projective, that contemporary models of computational geometry have brought to the design, to this design model. And so the beginning of these ideas from Ralph Knowles start to take form in his book, Energy and Form, 1964, written immediately after the energetic crisis of 1973, where he starts to talk about ideas behind solar exposure and its connection to energy production and energy consumption. The idea of the solar envelope is the expression of the solar envelope has not yet been formulated, has not been yet been used, but the ideas behind it are already present in the book. The first time that the expression solar envelope actually takes place is in this report to the Department of Energy that was written with Richard Berry, Solar Envelope Concepts, 1980. It's kind of amazing to to realize that this idea of the solar envelope, it's only 35 years old, 36 years old. One would imagine that this would be something that would have been in our disciplinary discussions for much longer, but it's not that old, actually. And as he explains, the solar envelope regulates development, urban development, within imaginary boundaries derived from the sun's relative motion. It's interesting to note that the expression that was first used is solar zoning envelope. That was the initial construction of the expression. And so this implies a clear understanding that the solar envelope is not just for a single building, a single lot, but actually has implications across the whole city. This is something that was emphasized yesterday by different speakers. I think Alexandra spoke about this, and I think it was also even mentioned by Jing Gang in her talk. And so if we were to construct a chronology of equations or expressions that have had an enormous impact in the definition of the urban fabric, and this is actually, don't steal this idea because I'm actually working on this project right now. So there would be a set of formulations that have had enormous widespread impact in the construction of the cities. We would have, for example, the Manning formula that regulates the flow of water on an open channel. This is basically the formula that has been used to design all drainage systems in most cities, and this formula is actually at the core of some of the serious flooding problems that we're experiencing, because it actually really has helped us, enabled us to design channels in ways that really, really move the water very, very well, very, very quickly. We could also include the formulas of FAR and coverage as, for example, as they were introduced in the New York zoning regulations of 1961 and how much they changed the city, New York City, from the 1916 to the 1961. And within this history, a place for the solar envelope of 1980, the solar envelope construction would need to have a place. Arguably, it hasn't had the same amount of impact as other formulations, as other expressions have had in the construction of the city, but it does have the same amount of potential in defining the whole construction of the city fabric. We tend to say that some mathematical equations are beautiful because they incorporate different physical processes that seem to be independent, and they seem to coalesce in a single expression. And the solar envelope has that beauty within it. It talks about issues of policy, form, density, cohesion, and it all come together in a single geometric construction. In schools of design, we're both attracted and we reject. We have an aversion towards determinism. And the solar envelope has this kind of love-hate attraction. We see it as something that has the possibility of being enormously productive, but at the same time, we are a little bit afraid of its deterministic, potentially deterministic qualities. Although, as we can see in this case, the flexibility that exists within the solar envelope is always very, very, very high. These kind of formulations have been taken by many different people, exploring new efficiencies in the organization of urban fabrics in relation to solar exposure. MVRDV has done this quite a bit, and obviously the use of computational tools, in this case Honeybee and Ladybug, the plugins for Grasshopper, have had enormous impact. And so the question of the conversation today is definitely not the same that it could have been 10 or 15 years ago in our understanding of the possibilities that the solar envelope or solar exposure in relation to built form has. And we expect that the panel, the conversations, the presentations today around this issue will start to illuminate some of this. The second panel that we're going to be talking about, it's called Commons. So independent of location or latitude, access to the sun is considered an ancient and individual right in many cultures. Several current politico-economic conceptions, however, protect it for health considerations, while others regulate it for energy reasons. Regardless of these two distinctions, Commons reconsiders both types of solar access to be issues of social equity, and it examines accordingly the tensions that exist between built form through capital accumulation and access to sunlight through environmental consensus. This is something that Charles explained quite well yesterday in that very nice axis, and today we will be talking about this. The New York Zoning Resolution of the 1916 and its image, its according image by Hugh Ferris in the Metropolis of Tomorrow, shows a tension between the access to light and capital accumulation. We could again talk about Hilbersheimer first studies about the relationship between solar exposure and density of the fabric, and the drawings that he did a few years later for the natures of the cities, in which he starts to look at how the same density can be maintained with different built form. This kind of study was later taken on by other modernist architects like Gropius and so on. Or we could look, obviously, at the solar envelope and Ralph Knowles, where the relationship between built form and solar exposure is not due to capital accumulation necessarily, not due to health implications also. It is related to both of these, but it's primarily related to energy consumption and potential production. And so in this case, we have like these three images that explain a different relationship between solar exposure and its negotiation with capital accumulation, health, and energy production. And we expect that the presentations today in the panel will move between, around, overlap these tensions and others that maybe have not been as solidified as this. I think it's important to bring into the context here that Ralph Knowles was already aware of the policy implications and the medium through which the solar envelope could be enabled. In an article in 1977 in JAE, he talks about solar energy building and the law, and he says, where their paths cross today, architects and lawyers can often be heard discussing solar energy. The popularity of this topic lies in a complex background of recent and historical events. The emerging fact is that anybody seriously concerned with future policies and designs governing building must consider solar energy as a way to temper the constructed environment. The policy implications of this emerging fact have been seriously discussed in legal terms by a growing number of experts who agree that two basic questions must be answered. First, who will make allocations of sunlight between competing users? Second, on what legal principles will this appointment be made? So this is something that was already, even before he actually started to use the expression solar envelope, he was already aware of these policy implications and how important the legal framework was going to be. In this context, and again, take into account that this is the 1970s, 1973, the energy crisis. This is 1979. Gail Boyer-Hayes produces this work, Solar Access Law, actually also published here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it's the first legal framework that starts to like encapsulate all these ideas that Ralph Knowles was starting to give physical form to. And they're unrelated, they're independent from one another, but they're obviously related to one another. The third panel would be zero sum. The energy crisis and economic shocks of the 1970s led to experimental and counterculture practices of architecture and urbanism. These practices enable the emergence of domestic applications and do-it-yourself methods of implementation in a new political economy of solar energy. The current environmental crisis embraces zero-carbon responses and has pushed the scale of operation to neoliberal corporate and governmental organizations. Zero sum reviews the shifts from the domestic to the urban, from the individual to the conglomerate, political or economical, and from the alternative to the new normal. This is, again, a very interesting shift that has happened within the period of 30 years. I think a very good example of the kind of new conscience, alternative conscience that emerged in the 1970s would be Steve Baer, the Baer House. He introduced many passive ideas about the built environment. In this case, you see the drum wall that was able to radiate energy into the building with the movable shutters that would be able to close and protect the home at different times of the year. And Steve Barr is someone that that was engaged in a lot of, let's say, alternative, do-it-yourself, hippish proposals, as like the Dumb Cookbook of the 1969. He also established a company that is still working today, SumWorks, where he explains the different components of the different gadgets that would define this new home. I think just today, I think Alexandra talked about how this kind of construction was preceded or already envisioned by Rainer Barnum in A Home is Not a House, where the house actually becomes a collection of these gadgets. And this is the 1970s. It's do-it-yourself. It's alternative. It's not supported by policy, not institutionalized. There's no money. But this kind of same mentality has shifted or has been brought up to a different kind of context in the past few years. And so now we have the new normal. It's this kind of mentality is fully backed by political research institutions. There's money, there's large teams taking care of this. It's no longer a do-it-yourself mentality. And maybe Masdar City, by Foster Partners, embraces this kind of mentality at this new scale. It's unclear what this project is going to turn out to be, as it was, well, its ambitions were put on hold, and as it was mentioned by one of the design managers, we are not going to try to shoehorn renewable energy into the city just to justify a definition created within a boundary. As of today, it's not a net zero future, it's about 50%. So they've really like readjusted, but there's still this ambition that exists. Within this context, it's interesting to see how the city continues to be explained as this collection of gadgets. So the mentality is the same, the way of explaining things is the same, but the environment within these discussions that are taking place has completely shifted from the home to the whole city. And so the project has been politicized, but to a certain extent, one could argue that it has been not yet fully theorized, or that this is still missing certain appropriate theoretical frameworks in order to talk about these issues at the scale of the city. And so these are the three panel sets of discussions that we're going to have today. In between, there's going to be like several presentations by Mariana, Eric Heller, and Scott Cohen, finally with Iñaki Avalos, that would talk about projects that would probably overlap all of these issues and others that are not specifically mentioned. So we will start with Mariana's presentation, and then we'll have plugins with Andrew Witt, Holly Samuelson, Andres Sepstuk, Silvia Benedito. It will be hosted by Florian Eidenberg. We'll have Eric Heller, well-deserved break. We'll start with the commons again in the afternoon. Yves Blau, Salman Craig, Lady Ascension, David Ma, myself, why not? It will be hosted by Carles Muro with a presentation by Scott Cohen. And the final panel will be the Zero Sum with Felipe Correa, Elizabeth Whitaker, Francesca Benedetto, Camilo Restrepo-Chea, and it will be hosted by Ashley Schaefer. So I really want to thank everybody again for the time. We all know that any kind of presentation takes a lot of time to prepare and get it ready. So I'm really grateful for your time and support. And I would like to start by presenting our first speaker, Mariana Ibañez. Mariana Ibañez is Associate Professor of Architecture here at the GSD, where she has been teaching since 2006-2007, 10 years. She was born in Argentina. And she received her Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Buenos Aires, attended the Architectural Association in London for her Master of Architecture degree. Her thesis work at the AA focused on responsive environments through the implementation of adaptive structures. After her graduate thesis, she worked at Arup at the Advanced Geometry Unit and also at the office of Zaha Hadid in London, where she led the team for the London Aquatic Centre of the 2012 London Olympic Games. With her partner, Simon Keane, she has an office called IK Studio, and a research adjacent practice that focuses on dynamic behaviors. Please help me welcome Mariana Ibañez.
think they're going to switch the screen. Thanks so much, Sergio, for the introduction, and both you and Charles for inviting me to the party. It's always very exciting to be here. And of course, upon receiving the invitation to be part of Heliomorphism, I started thinking about which projects I was going to present and how to present them, to try to more explicitly address some of the central questions that the conference is foregrounding. And I wanted to do this through the interest that I have both as a practitioner and as an academic. So as a result, rather than presenting a building project or a single project, I will share a series of projects, not all of them, don't worry, but some, or a cross-section of ideas that I feel comfortable labeling as one of my intellectual projects. So as Sergio said, we are interested in dynamic behaviors, and not only as an environmental condition, but as a condition of matter, of objects, of experience, and so on. And this is paired with a focus on physical computing, and as both medium and technique. So we develop a lot of tools at the same time that we use those tools to generate projects. And this always goes back in the way we do things to the relationship between analog and digital phenomena. So in this case, the initial sort of claim that I'm making in relationship to heliomorphism is that it already addresses this premise of the relationship between the analog and the digital and the dynamic behavior that is in connection with many other behaviors. So helio, I would say, as from the sun, exists only in tandem with other phenomena in the way we look at them through our projects. Sometimes this phenomena is natural, sometimes not. And even though I am very interested in the relationship between natural conditions and architecture in our projects, it seems that at some point in the process, there is always a plug. Hence the title of my lecture, Lights On. So Lights On proposes it's like an architectural speculation embedded in a technological world. And our idea of ecology includes the dynamic conditions of natural processes, man-made physical processes, and computational processes. And it is in the relationship between these three realms that the projects are situated. Some are built and some are pure research. They're all experimental in nature, what I'm going to show today, yet seek to develop knowledge and ideas that are to be transferred eventually, hopefully soon, to the built environment. So first, just a basic illustration of the possible relationships between architectural objects and the natural environment. I think in the same way that it is also surprising to me that that book was from the 80s, it seems that for a long time, and still in the minds of many designers today, this idea of a static context and a static design object still exists, which is very surprising to me. And if you go down that sort of gradient, we can get to obviously many levels of kind of dynamic condition, which I think is amongst these propositions the paradigm where we situate our work. And as we add specific variables to that diagram, the set becomes more complex, more intricate, but what is important is that it's a set, it's not a pair. And this is perhaps my first reflection on the topic of the lecture, that at least in our work, it's not only the relationship between, I would say, the helioforces and the sun and form, but this is paired within a much larger constellation of variables that are at some point sort of equal within the equation. So there are, of course, an infinite number of iterations that we could do, centralized, non-centralized, more or less connected, adding, removing, or exchanging elements from any of these instances. But the main issue here that I want to introduce is perhaps best represented in the bottom right, which is the possibility of a non-human-centric world where different agencies can also exist simultaneously. So the projects I'm going to show could easily be described as architectural machines, I guess, framing that context of simultaneity, in which the environment, again, natural and artificial, is an active agent in determining the architectural outcomes. I decided to start with this project. Actually, I never showed this project before. It's a student project, and that some of students did in a seminar I taught a few years ago with Alan Sayegh. It was the Augmented Environments seminar. So the project is called Blooming. I don't know why the text is out. So blooming is a collection of cones in which solar panels and LED lights are embedded in a structure. The piece is absolutely symmetrical, it's a perfect sphere. And it's not round because it's mimicking the sound, but because it's meant to be rolled around. The layers that were used to build the prototypes are used to resolve the technical and structural needs of the project. It has a rigid core that provides both structure and surface area in which to mount all the systems that make the piece work. It has Arduino boards, it has 2 layers of light that are networked, and then it has solar panels. And obviously, the cones also and the shades need to be attached to that structure. Each of the cones is a cell that can be charged individually, but as the ball rolls around, each panel gets exposed to the sun and charged individually. Still, in a second, you're going to see how the behavior of the whole piece is actually networked. So as the day goes by, and depending on the amount of interaction between the ball and a user, the cones might all get charged equally or not. So it doesn't mean that when night comes, this whole thing will glow as a sphere, but somehow it will register the type of interactions and the translations of those interactions into energy that the piece had. So the resulting pattern or light configuration is literally a reflection of that, and it changes every day, and it changes with every interaction. And in this case, so we have the input from the sound, the input from the user, and the piece that mediates and creates somehow a response to those 2 things. We do, just a quick intro before I start talking about the Philadelphia Mask, we do a lot of urban projects that are so far all self-generated. They're not necessarily funded. In a similar way, without the party, we sort of think about topics that we're interested in investigating, and we sort of create a framework. And in particular, we've been choosing cities around the world, and the first one we did was the Philadelphia Mask. In which, in comparison to the previous project, the idea of input and output is a little bit more explicitly addressed. And it's a multi-agent plan for the city of Philadelphia. The first thing we noticed when we started going there was the enormous amount of vacant lots that are not only large in number, but are widely distributed in the city regardless of real estate value. So in this project, we were interested in researching how we cognitively map our environment or how we perceive our location via references. And we were interested in using these lots to become those references. So traveling throughout the city, we selected a few empty sites, and giving their location and context, we created a grand narrative of a mask, or a theatrical reimagining of the city, where architectural folies that we call characters may interact among themselves and with city occupants. Obviously, the project is very much related to, say, Haydock's Vladivostok and Mask of Medusa. So we created a series of tools, and here you see a demo of the characters in action as they distort the city map. So together, these agents can generate a new set of city plans or morphologies that suggest different realities for Philadelphia. And the test of reclaiming these empty lots can be one where the reconfiguration of an entire city layout or some kind of local conditions can be transformed due to temporal needs, demographics, or any other pressures. So the proposed distortions are not meant to be physical. We're not saying this is how we're going to transform Philadelphia, but it's mainly a test of, again, this kind of relational model that sometimes is visible and it has physicality, and sometimes is invisible and it responds to, emergent conditions. But eventually we feel that this could actually generate a new reality, physical reality for Philadelphia. So each one of these characters is given a name, assigned the formal logic. It could be monolithic, striated, linear, a medium of expression, light, sound. We also work with kinetics. We work a lot with kinetics. And a condition that they respond to: population density, traffic patterns, distance to buildings, or one of them to the sun. So each character is also assigned a fiducial marker that is used to track its position and relationship to other characters. And what you see on the bottom, which was part of the video before, is a demonstration of the tracking system that translates the analog condition into the digital realm. So again, this constant transformation allows us to connect the physical world with the digital world. They're not one a representation of the other, but within both, many decisions are being made. So this is just focusing in one of the characters. It's the one that has kinetic properties. And the prototype is part of a larger investigation that looks into the reconfiguration of solid figures that uses the principle of a hinge dissection. So a rectangular volume is dissected and unpacked to accommodate 4 rotations that shift the adjacencies of the parts and creates the overall effects that the piece produces at different stages in the transformation. So that was kind of like really an intro to these, which is part of the prototype is part of our submission for the PS1 competition that in 2011 we got to participate in, organized by MoMA. And we used the same principle of a hinge dissection, in this case at 2 scales, to develop the plan and to design the proposed structure. So the mechanical garden was the name of the project, uses the principle of a Dieudonné dissection to transform the triangular patio of PS1, which is what you see on the left, into a courtyard. So the idea behind that was that we were interested in what we call the spectacle of urban life, or the life that happens between the center and the perimeter. We wanted a courtyard and a colonnade, so basically the most basic urban organization that you can find, but we wanted to actualize that by the properties of the material that defines it. So shade is very important in the MoMA brief, the first thing they tell you, because this is used throughout the day and it gets very hot in the summer, that you cannot use string, although this year's project was all string. That string does not provide for shade, and that it needs to be enough to host people throughout the day. So the courtyard has no shade at all. There's no trees and there's no artificial structures to produce shade. So we decided to incorporate the sun into the narrative of the project. So also using the device of the character as a means to differentiate each structure unit from one another, we created 9 characters. 8 are actually physical, and they make the colonnade, and I will describe them in a minute. And the 9th character is the gray triangle you see on that diagram, which is defined by 2 extremes of the dissection. So basically it was like a geometrical process to find that triangle. But our decision was that that was going to be the 9th character, and that character was going to have 2 characteristics. It was going to be a void, and it was never going to be in shade. So it's actually the only point in the courtyard that it has sunlight all the time. So basically, we designed all of the structures around it to create, they were responding to kind of program and circulation, and obviously some aesthetic preferences, structural needs, et cetera, but also formally, they were iteratively tested such that that center space that we consider one of the core elements of the project was always in light. The units are resolved through a collection of tetrahedrons that combine in various ways to create tree-like structures. And the idea is that the base model is repeated and modified to create a wide range of options for seating and canopy, so the units don't repeat, but they're always kind of variations of one another. We built this one-to-one prototype that was actually kinetic, and to test structure, formal plasticity, and material definition. So with one base form, basically, many configurations can be achieved. The sun moves through the day and obviously the summer months. And the canopy is designed, amongst other things, to keep the 9th character, as I said, as a center of light. And the courtyard is used as a public space during the day and for parties during the night. Now, this is kind of like a dramatic switch. So going more into the kind of technological part of my argument and behaviors. So just a short detour to introduce these devices that will be important in a minute. So we work a lot with Mark Im, who's the director of the Modular Robotics Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a longtime collaborator and the mastermind behind these robots. And these are the types of things that those robots can do. And we use these devices in many projects at different scales, mainly for installations and prototypes. They temporarily allow us to test ideas that are difficult to implement on an architectural scale, but it is central still to our work and our projects to speculate about what their architecture could be like. So we're developing a prototype for this project in the spring, so stay tuned. This is Polyhouse, which is a project that uses these modular robots to create a deployable system to provide temporary adaptive shelter units. And the idea is that adaptation is to respond to various environmental conditions like terrain, weather, proximity, density, relationship to other structures, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, hopefully that will work. The next project is part of a series of, actually this image is just to also introduce a series of projects that use conic sections and their aggregations as a formal strategy. And it has generated several projects in the past maybe 2 or 3 years that use cones, conic sections, arches, vaults, domes, et cetera, et cetera. I'm only showing this one, which I think is a little bit more relevant to the conference topic, which is a project we did for the Play Day event that takes place in the summer at the *The* in Boston, near the Seaport District. So it's an interactive installation that connects material effects with performance. A series of cones, again, are aggregated to produce a closed solid, and we installed in these cones microphones, speakers, and LEDs are embedded within the structure, and the visitors, basically, they speak their secrets, their thoughts or messages into these cones, and the messages get amplified and distorted, become anonymous, and they're shared with a larger crowd. So in this case, during the day, sound was the medium of expression to augment the physical project, but at night there were 2 modes, recording and speaking, that echoed a 2-tone variation that went from blue to magenta. So again, the connection between a material effect and a behavior. So the next project takes a little bit this idea of these pavilions, but is connected somehow to the Philly Mass project that I showed, in its attempt to have architectural interventions produce urban transformations. So the project begins with Ellicott's 1792 plan that was really a derivation from the original plan designed by L'Enfant, where a rectangular grid interrupted by diagonal boulevards were introduced to link the DC's spaces of power. So our project disrupts these boulevards and the connections they're meant to establish by transforming them through the pressure of architectural agents, again, another multi-agent system, and the relationships they have with the environment. And while they operate autonomously, they have the capacity to produce global change. We produce a lot of these kinds of documents in trying to kind of graphically understand the type of kind of computational underpinnings and the behaviors that we want to program into the agents, and also because this is usually what we share with other architects. And so these are kind of graphic rules. What you see on the screen are graphic rules, and these are represent the logic of the computer programming. So as agents, they don't have a scale, really. They have behaviors and relationships to sets of hypothetical context conditions. And the initial effect of the transformation is this breaking apart of the plan of the city to become re-articulated through the insertion of new structures and infrastructures for the production of public space and a new form of order. And in this case, we produced this prototype that was a study of the exchange between individual actual and global phenomena. So again, we create this kind of devices to transform physical information into some type of kind of digital environment and language. The next project I'm including is an example of how we operate across scales. So this eventually becomes a city. And it is based on the relationship between, it starts with the relationship of body and space and how we imagine small-scale devices present architectural opportunity. So in this scenario, we developed a robotic wearable prototype for a pilot project with Opera Philadelphia. They came to us because they were concerned about the future of the genre and the loss of audience, and they wanted to test ideas. So we did a first project where we staged Orpheus and Eurydice, and we created this prototype, which is the serpent that kills Eurydice. And so this is a soft robotics snake that it's a collection of fixed geometry modules with air pockets that with a single arm, using pneumatic air inflation, can move. And I'll just have a short video. So the resulting motion basically creates this very supple and organic movement that is flexible. She did not get killed. So, anyways. So this is a compliant mechanism. Also, we've been testing compliant mechanisms a lot in the past few years, and it can deform and elongate and flatten or inflate to different scenarios, basically allowing for environment-ready adaptations. So again, we immediately try to imagine the architectural implications of these ideas and devices. And in this case, we imagine that we can proliferate them and create a field and aggregate them to produce a closed environment. And then we produced that animation, which is actually, we call it a heliotropic test, which the units in this case were responsive to a light source that was kind of moving through, and that in this case it was artificial, but now it's got me thinking about something else. So in this project, nothing is plugged, really, but I wanted to show it as a reference to my original statement of the dynamic static versus dynamic relationships. So this is Raleigh Polygon, and it's a spatial unit constructed out of carbon fiber. The first phase of the project was developed in collaboration with Andrew John Witt, not our Andrew Witt, another one, from Temple University. And on the screen, what you see is some of the spooling diagrams that were developed to figure out how to program the robotic arm that layered the fibers. And the geometry is designed to accommodate various positions and relationships to the ground. So in this case, again, the context is completely static. But on the second stage, we incorporated interactive technology, and now the unit is part of a network of units that are connected to one another. And it's not only the actions of the occupation that condition the interaction, but the position of the units and the relationship to the immediate context. So again, in this case, our context was fairly static. This happened on an indoor, fairly controlled space, but the piece itself basically transformed its relationship to it. Nancy and Sputnik are the result of a competition we won last year to produce an installation in Calgary during the Beakerhead Festival. And this is, I wanted to present this also because I think Sergio also said it about this kind of type of relational modeling in which multiple variables can be sort of considered at different stages in the process. So this is another situation where a series of pieces that were going to be installed both during daytime and nighttime, and the desire to make them different and meaningful in both situations. So as in all the previous projects, materiality and effects are for us directly correlated, or I would add actually assembly to those two. And I think we actually use light as a material, both natural and artificial. So the geometries we wanted to test require specific strategies for faceting and folding. So decisions about form and materiality provided the opportunity to use reflections in Sputnik, so it was really more meaningful during the day with the reflections of the sun, and at night we had sort of lights inside that created actually deep shades on the surface, and emissions in Nancy, which was like transparent, and basically it let the sun go through, but at night it was a source of light. And this is the last project I'm going to show, so bear with me, I'm almost done. It's under development, but I thought it was interesting to try to kind of close with that. And this project seeks to test mobility at the scale of both architecture and the city. It's called the automotive. And automotive operates at 3 scales. I'm going to focus on the last one, but I will go quickly through the other 2. The first one is a small space, just maybe a house or something like that. The second one is a medium-sized building. At this point, it's just placed on a very generic, deployed somewhere context. And the last one is an urban element that made of smaller parts that need to be choreographed or be able to maintain transformability simultaneously. So we have these units, and we created these models, these concrete models that were made to test individual and collective mobility particularly, but other behavioral effects. So we plug them, and we find ways to plug everything, such that we can test other input, and in this case, we just tested vibrations that we imagine could come either from the internal pieces or from the environment. Sorry, I don't have my control, so I want to get to, well, it doesn't matter. At the top, I didn't want to put the sound because it's a little bit annoying, but basically you start seeing the pieces vibrate and how they change the context in which they're placed. In this case, it was like a granular kind of sandy context. But I don't know how long it's going to take. I might not show it. And then we created a tool to analyze at the larger scales through aggregation how the behavior of the species was transforming the map around it. All right, I'll just show that another time. And so this is where we're at, right, in terms of its urban application. It proposes a collection of elements that operate at different scales. And they're articulated via behaviors that result from formal decisions and the interactions amongst themselves and with the environment in terms of orientation, rotation, and again, behavior. So this is my last slide, but I wanted to finish with kind of just like a closing comment, this idea that when we design, environment, form, and effects are never just causes or consequences of a design act. There are active agents in the design process. And this is where the idea of bewilderment, that is part of my lecture title, sort of comes into play. That it suggests an architecture of kind of effects, and in a sense with these experimental projects, this idea of overwhelming of the senses, that is systematized, and not dissimilar to the aesthetic idea of sublimity. And it works in logics of sensation and the deconstruction of meaning in objects. So Lights On, what I prepared for today, sort of takes this idea of the, I think, heliomorphism and includes it into a broader set of variables that assign sort of behavior and dynamic conditions both within the design process and sometimes to the architectural objects or the urban propositions. It's an investigation of an active medium, basically, that we always try to take it into the unknown so new territories can be found. Thank you.